Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Natives Against Nativism, Antiracism and Indigenous Critique in Postcolonial France, by Olivia C. Harrison. Narrated by Siiri Scott. Publisher's note. In this audio edition, you will hear references to figures present in the print and e-book formats of the book. Prologue. A beautiful late morning in August 2019, Carpinteria State Beach, Santa Barbara County. Since my partner and I moved to Los Angeles in 2009, this has become one of our favorite spots, and we take our two daughters here often. We've barely set up our little camp when I hear a cheerful voice booming from the thicket of beach chairs and umbrellas 10 feet to our left. How do we know the Indians were here first? They had a reservation. Thin laughs ring out, and a guffaw. The booming voice is that of a 20-something-year-old. The laughs are those of his brothers or cousins, maybe also his dad. All from L.A., it turns out. Our kids befriended their clan. There is something unsettling about hearing this joke, delivered on a state beach, that explicitly acknowledges the displacement that makes possible our presence in Southern California. The interpretive playground located immediately behind the spot we've picked out is dedicated to the Indigenous Americans who lived here when the Spaniards came, the Chumash. Perhaps unwittingly, the joke constitutes a tacit acknowledgement of the fact that Indians were indeed here first. We, however, didn't have a reservation. How does one interpret this joke? Sitting uncomfortably in what was, moments before, our spot on the beach, I bristle at what I perceive to be its colonial arrogance, and also its recuperation of the figure of the Indian to articulate a nativist claim. To begin, the implication that we don't know if the Indians were here first, if we did, the joke would be superfluous, and then the play on the term reservation, voided of its terror and violence, equated with a mundane act that is somehow also elitist and therefore worthy of mockery and scorn. I was here first is an expression associated with competition. The implication is clear. Those who make reservations get first dibs, fairly or not. If the Indians were here first, we were here second. They had a reservation, we didn't. But that doesn't make us any less native or nativist. Primed by my training in colonial history and anticolonial theory, what I hear in this pun is the performance of settler colonial legitimacy. Fast forward to an evening in October 2021. I've decided to write a prologue for my book, and I'm immersed in a worn first edition of Vine Deloria Jr.'s classic, Custer Died for Your Sins, an Indian Manifesto. The chapter I'm reading is a particularly good one. Titled Indian Humor, it offers a riotously funny and moving account of the importance of jokes, often self-disparaging ones, in the cohesion and survival of Indigenous Americans in the United States. Suddenly, a jolt of recognition. Popovi Day, the great Pueblo artist, was quizzed one day on why the Indians were the first ones on this continent. "We had reservations," was his reply. It turns out the joke about Indians, casually uttered on Chumash land, is an Indian joke, with a twist. In Deloria's telling, the pun on reservations was authored by an Indigenous American in response to an apparently naive question, a quiz, about prior occupancy, the very basis for Indigenous claims to sovereignty in the United States. Popovi Day's whimsical retort manages to tease out the unspoken implications of the question. Why were the Indians first? is another way of saying, how do we know they were first? Or, why should it matter if they were? Even as it satirizes the competition over nativeness that is staged in this disingenuous Q&A with a native informant. The subtle critique of nativism that obtains in Day's joke, as it is relayed by Deloria, appears in its contemporary retelling, which calls into question indigenous claims to prior occupancy rather than colonial claims to nativism. At stake in the remediation of an Indian joke on occupied land is the continued contest for indigeneity in 21st century America. My discomfort upon hearing an Indian joke delivered in a familiar and beloved place was, in part, based on the sense of alienation that has regularly assailed me since the unleashing of discourses targeting political correctness and other liberal civilities during the presidential election of 2016. I should not have been surprised. The nativist arrogance that was displayed during that electoral season had an all too familiar ring. It was as if decades of French history had come crashing down onto the New World. What had been evident in France for the past half-century under the veneer of Republican egalitarianism, an increasingly unapologetic affirmation of white, Christian, European identity against the invasion of foreign migrants, was suddenly creeping out from behind the pillars of American democracy. Working on grassroots anti-racism in France, from the migrant rights movements of the 1970s to 21st century collectives like the Indigeneity de la République, natives of the Republic, felt like writing a prehistory of our contemporary American moment. The shock of recognition I experienced hearing an American joke on Chumash land coincided with the realization that anti-immigrant nativism has something to do with anti-native racism. Unlike the United States, France is not a settler colony, but it had a settler colony, and one that tried to secede from France, too, Algeria. Surveying the vast expanse of Algerian plains, the French conquistadores of Africa compared themselves to New World pioneers, their contemporaries, and the indigènes to American Indians. For some, extermination was a noble precedent in the pursuit of racial supremacy. Others sought to set France's civilizing mission apart from the United States race wars. I am not one to believe, writes Ferdinand Huguenet, one of the most inspired apologists for colonization as civilization, that we are fatally destined to push the inhabitants of Algeria into the desert, like the Yankees chase the Indians. Fast forward 250 years, the descendants of France's post-colonial migrants from Algeria and the four corners of France's tricontinental empire take on the identity indigène to claim nativeness in the land that colonized their ancestors. At stake in this reappropriation of colonial identity is a contest for indigeneity that resembles, in tenor, if not in tone, the competition for nativeness staged and satirized in Popovide's joke. Natives Against Nativism began as a study of the intersection of anti-racist and pro-Palestinian activism in France from 1970 to the present. Palestine remains a central interlocutor in the archive I mobilize in this book for reasons I will detail momentarily. In the course of my research, however, it became clear that I would need to contend with another figure of indigeneity in France, one that is often triangulated via the Palestinian question, the figure of the Indian disseminated via Hollywood westerns to countless households in France, and remediated, as we will note, in anticolonial and anti-racist literature from the 1980s to the present. Far from being occasional points of interest for anti-racist activists, the twin figures of the Palestinian and the Indian have been instrumental, I argue, in developing a critique of colonial and post-colonial racism based on identification across imperial formations, in this case, France, the United States, and Israel. The stakes and focus of the project have sharpened since I started researching the topic in 2011, partly in response to the rise of increasingly unapologetic anti-immigrant discourses across the political spectrum, and under pressure from a highly polarized cultural climate in which to speak critically of colonialism or race is now equated with Islamo-leftism, an ill-defined amalgam of post-colonial and critical race theory, both purportedly imposed by the tyranny of U.S.-style political correctness. Against this blatant disavowal of decades of anti-colonial and anti-racist activism in France, the texts I analyze in this book, novels, memoirs, essays, militant newspapers, tracts, posters, manifestos, documentary films, unpublished plays, and film scripts by anonymous activists, little-known writers, and major public figures are all invested to varying degrees in articulating what I will be calling indigenous critique throughout the sections of this book, a critical understanding of the colonial production of indigenous subjects, indigènes, natives, and the afterlives of the history of subjectification in the post-colonial era. Mahmoud Mamdani has pervasively argued that the great crime of colonialism went beyond expropriating the native, the name it gave to the indigenous population. The greater crime was to politicize indigeneity in the first place. Mamdani's urgent critique of the politicization of the indigeneity in the colony needs to be updated, I argue, in the context of the former colonial metropoles of Europe, where indigeneity, in the sense of nativeness, has become a rallying cry for the anti-immigrant right. This book is about the political meanings of indigenous critique in a nation-state that presents itself as chronologically and ideologically post-colonial, although, as in the United States, Australia, and other settler colonies, a non-negligible number of French citizens consider themselves colonized today, from the outer reaches of the Pacific to the former metropole itself. As I will detail in the chapters that follow, anti-racist activists in France have, for decades, looked to indigenous struggles in other imperial contexts to think through their post-colonial condition. Stretching the borders of coloniality to include France's poussière d'empire, imperial dust, Tahitian writer Chantal Spitz reclaims the term indigène and its politically correct cousin, autochtone, from the colonial archive in order to reactivate anti-colonialism in the purportedly post-colonial present. More recently, anti-racist activists in France have situated their struggles in continuation with indigenous resistance to colonialism since 1492, even though the demand for equal rights in post-colonial France and claims to territorial sovereignty in the Americas, the Pacific, and Palestine remain fundamentally different. As we will discuss, these claims to indigeneity are not always or only empirical. Rather than discount such forms of trans-indigenous identification as anachronistic, identitarian, and ideologically dangerous, as they habitually are in France, I take seriously their invitation to critique colonial modernity, writ large, to include contemporary forms of nativist discourse in the post-colonial metropole. It turns out that indigènes have something to teach us about nativism. Introduction. Indigenous critique. In January 2005, a collective of grassroots anti-racist activists published an online petition calling for the constitution of a post-colonial anti-colonial movement in France. Nous sommes les indigènes de la République. We are the natives of the Republic. The title of the petition is, in itself, a rebuke and a rallying cry. Coined by colonial administrators to refer to the inhabitants of the territories conquered by France, enshrined into law in the late 19th century with the Code de l'Indigène, the nomenclature indigène made official the distinction between citizens and subjects of France. Although the Code de l'Indigène was abolished in 1946, for the signatories of the appeal, it continues to structure the present. The treatment of populations hailing from the colonies, issus de la colonisation, extends colonial policies without being reduced to them. The figure of the indigène continues to haunt political, administrative, and judiciary practices. It animates and grafts itself onto other logics of oppression, discrimination, and social exploitation. Breaking with the mainstream anti-racist discourses that have dominated representations of racism in France since the founding of the Socialist Party-backed organization SOS Racisme in 1984, discourses centered on universal Republican ideals of equality, tolerance, and secularism. The appeal insists on situating systemic racism in the longue durée history of the French Empire and its aftermath, including the history of colonial and post-colonial migration. Nous sommes les indigènes de la République garnered more than 1,000 signatures in 2 weeks and drew 3,000 activists to its first event, launching a new anti-racist collective, the Mouvement des Indigènes de la République, renamed Parti des Indigènes de la République, or Beur, in 2010. As scholars have noted, the context of emergence of the movement was a highly polarized one. In addition to the divisive 2004 law prohibiting religious attire in schools, which, albeit couched in universal terms, clearly targeted Muslim women, debates on the proposed article of law mandating that school teachers recognize the positive role of French presence overseas, in particular North Africa, were raging at the time. 10 months after the appeal was published, urban rebellions broke out across disenfranchised communities in France to protest the deaths of Ziad Benna and Bouna Traoré, 2 unarmed teenagers pursued by police officers, giving a renewed sense of urgency to the indictment of structural racism in the opening lines of the appeal. Discriminated against in hiring, housing, health, school, and leisure, persons hailing from the colonies, issus du colony, former and current, and post-colonial immigrants are the first victims of social exclusion and precariousness. The banlieues are said to be lawless zones that the Republic is called upon to reconquer. Racial profiling, diverse provocations, persecutions of all kinds proliferate, while police brutality, sometimes extreme, is only rarely sanctioned by a justice system that operates according to double standards. The government's recourse to a state of emergency law, first put on the books during the Algerian War of Independence to quell the uprisings, and the racially coded language deployed by politicians and intellectuals alike, only confirmed the appeal's insistence on the links between colonial history and structural racism in post-colonial France. Published simultaneously on the websites uma.com and tutsigo.net, and then on lmsi.net, websites known to be critical of the 2004 law banning religious attire in French schools, the petition quickly drew condemnations across the political spectrum, ranging from accusations of communautarisme, U.S. identity-style politics, perceived as a threat to the unity of the Republic, to a covert Islamist agenda and speculations about the alleged anti-Semitism of members of the collective. But what irked commentators most about the appeal, I would argue, was the use of the term indigène. Inadmissible from an empirical perspective according to historians, anthropologists, and sociologists, the misuse of a colonial identity that no longer existed was proof of a pathological desire to compete for the status of victim, in particular with the quintessential figure of the victim in France, the Jew. In the words of the president of SOS Racisme at the time, Dominique Sopo, the appeal is exemplary of an exotico-victimary approach to memory, where past colonial crimes are deployed to prove the perpetual victimhood of the formerly colonized. The right's reaction to grassroots anti-racism has been even more caustic. In a now familiar spin on the belated turn to colonial history in the past several decades, the demand to historicize the present is cast as a call for colonial repentance, what, in a 1983 text that has become a classic of anti-immigrant discourses, Pascal Bruckner called the tears of the white man. The almost consensual reading of the appeal as identitarian is particularly ironic, given the deliberately inclusive nature of the text, which begins by denouncing the indigenization of all inhabitants of the banlieue and ends with an explicitly coalitionist call to found an anti-colonial movement. Regardless of their origins, the populations of working-class neighborhoods, les populations des quartiers, are indigenized, relegated to the margins of society. We, descendants of African slaves and deportees, daughters and sons of colonized and immigrants, we, French and non-French living in France, activists engaged in the struggle against the oppression and discrimination produced by the post-colonial republic, launch an appeal to all those who have a stake in these struggles to gather in a Congress of anti-colonialism. The emphatic use of the first-person plural in the petition's envoi articulates, it is true, a particular collective identity. We, the descendants of enslaved and colonized populations, we who are French citizens and also immigrants, we, the inheritors, héritiers, of the enslaved and colonized, as the appeal puts it elsewhere. And yet, the final call to all who have a stake in these struggles is left deliberately open. The charge of communitarianism, you are speaking only for and to the descendants of the colonized, only highlights the surreptitious forms of racialization at work in universalist critiques of particular claims for equality and justice. In this sense, the backlash against the appeal inadvertently gives credence to its indictment of racism. In France, immigrants and French citizens, issus de l'immigration, of immigrant descent, as the expression has it, as if immigration were a hereditary condition, are seen as a fifth column, mining France from within. Against the prevailing view of non-white French citizens as perpetual immigrants or foreigners, the appeal insists on the colonial genealogy of current forms of discrimination against persons hailing from the colonies, former and current, and post-colonial immigrants. In doing so, it also cites migration and racialization in a centuries-long colonial history that begins not with decolonization and post-colonial migration, but with conquest, slavery, and subtler colonialism. Against the dehistoricized view of immigrants as guests, predominant in the liberal discourse of hospitality, or invaders, ubiquitous in far-right discourse, the appeal anchors the anti-racist struggle, what it calls the decolonization of the Republic, in the longue durée history of anti-colonial resistance, from the African continent to France's overseas territories in the Antilles and the Indian and Pacific Oceans. Of course, the descendants of the colonized in France are not colonial subjects. Without subscribing to the reductive critique according to which such an appeal to indigeneity is either communitariste or anachronistic, it is important to acknowledge that the Peur's demands cannot be conflated with the claims of indigenous peoples in the settler colonies of the Americas and the Pacific Rim, claims that are centered round national sovereignty and land restitution. Indigeneity is still a metaphor for the racialized minority that wields it. What is at stake, then, in claiming the term native to speak of French citizens of colonized descent and their anti-racist allies? In an important sense, this term is a provocation, as evidenced by the instantaneous outcry against the Beur, which has only grown as the movement, and since 2010, the self-declared political party, has become more media-savvy and more visible in the public arena. If historians are right that the status of the indigène under colonial law cannot be conflated with the history of racialization in post-colonial France, it is also true that, today, a significant number of French citizens and immigrants, hailing from the colonies, locate their experience of racialization squarely within the history of French Empire. The use of the term indigène by the descendants of the colonized makes manifest what sociologist Abdali Ajat calls le transfert colonial, the colonial transfer of discursive and legal forms of racism developed in the colonies. Like the appropriation of the racial designations Arabe, Beur, Rebu, Rabza, or Noir, Renoir, Black, Kebla. In the 1980s and 1990s, the use of the term indigène in the early 2000s both exposes and denounces the processes of racialization that produced these identities in the first place. But the term has a third performative valence that is less frequently commented upon. By calling themselves les indigènes de la République, these decolonial militants are also claiming indigeneity, nativeness, in post-colonial France. The children and grandchildren of colonial subjects of France, relegated to the status of second-class citizens in the post-colonial metropole, are not, in fact, immigrants in the dehistoricized sense implied in media and political discourses across the political spectrum. To quote an anti-racist slogan oft used by the Beur, Nous sommes ici parce que vous étiez là-bas. We are here, in France, because you were there, in the colonies. Nous sommes les indigènes de la République is in this sense a performative rather than empirical declaration of identity, one that is wielded against the ahistorical view of post-colonial citizens as perpetual outsiders. As Beur co-founder Auria Boutelja continues to insist, indigène is first and foremost a political identity. The catachrestic metaphor, "we are the natives of the Republic," simultaneously articulates subjection and subjecthood. As second-class citizens, we remain subjects of France, indigènes, and yet we are French subjects, natives of France. The double gerund offers an ironic reversal of white nativist claims to Frenchness, an anti-racist appropriation of indigeneity, in the sense of nativeness, that is
Sample complete. Ready to continue?